Hi Jill, and
Hello, Joe.
thank you first of all for letting us come into your home today. I really wanted to come and spend some time with you and let others who work in Medway and also for our community to understand a bit about the work that you do for us at the hospital. I feel really privileged to have been able to work with you, Jill, because when I first started working in healthcare, I knew very little about organ donation. You were very kind enough to come and spend some time with me and teach me, really. And what I wanted to do is really share some of the things I've learned and some of the things that you've learned through your own experience about organ donation. So maybe the first place to start is actually to talk a little bit about TRIS, which is the reason why we're here and why you got involved. So why don't you tell me a little bit about TRIS first of all?
Tris was a really vital, charismatic person who always had a challenge and a project on the go. He did many things in his life, including sailing around the world, climbing Kilimanjaro, and always had plans. He was his initial degree was in computing and mechanical engineering, but he wanted to do something related to medicine. So in his 50s, he embarked on a degree in operating department practice. He was very fortunate to be accepted at Christchurch, Canterbury. Did most of his work at Medway campus, which was extremely convenient, and in July 2014 got his second degree in operating department practice. He was successful in getting a job at Medway Hospital in theatres in recovery, which was his love, because he did like to communicate with people and with patients, and he was very skilled at it. After 3 months, he cycled to work on January the 2nd, 2015, and had a cardiac arrest when he got to work. We didn't know there was anything wrong with him. It was completely out of the blue, and my life fell apart on that day. He was immediately resuscitated in theatres, and despite initial optimism, he didn't ever regain consciousness and died after 12 days in intensive care. So I, like you, knew very little about organ donation. We had we were both signed up to the organ donor register, not ever thinking that was going to be something we were asked to do, but when I knew Tris was going to die, which I knew for a week before he died, there were two things that I was really thinking about. One was that I was going to lose him, and secondly, that I was desperate for something positive to come from his death, and I was desperate for him to be an organ donor.
I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for you. Those 12 days must have been some of the hardest of your life, and I think that's true for so many of the people that come into Medway Hospital. And I've always felt that we are so fortunate to have such skilled clinicians, doctors and nurses who can support families at such a difficult time. And I'm very proud of all of those doctors and nurses, but also our specialist bereavement nurses and our chaplaincy. You know, they have links out with all sorts of multi-faith leaders to help families, and I think that whilst it's a terrible thing to have to go through in life, I hope that the hospital in some way was there and supported you in the right way to do that.
You are absolutely right. I've been a doctor for over 30 years at that point, so I had some understanding of what a traumatic situation was. I suppose I naively thought I might have more understanding than I actually did, because when I was in it, I realised I didn't at all. But the critical care staff were absolutely fantastic. You are in a protective bubble, and so we were looked after, and this is we in the sense of my family as well as me, by the doctors, the nurses. You form particularly close relationships with the nurses who were looking after Tris, and they wanted me to bring in photographs so they could see him in normal life, because suddenly, of course, he was unconscious on a ventilator. And yes, I mean, that I will never forget that support.
It's such an important part of helping someone through their passing, and also helping the family, and making those really tough choices. The things that I have been always so impressed about when we've spoken is your love and respect for Tris. I mean, it comes through. Your face lights up when you talk about him, and knowing that the hospital was able to help you through that difficult period means a great deal to me, and as I'm sure it does to all of the colleagues in intensive care. So was it hard to make the decision about organ donation?
Actually, no. I asked Paul when I knew there was no hope that Tris was going to recover. I know they would have asked me had I not raised it, because that is something that they would do in that set of circumstances. I was desperate for something very positive to come from Tris's death, and I can't tell you where that thought came from, because it just came to me in that moment. We'd spoken about organ donation very, very briefly. I knew that Tris carried a donor card, as did I, and always had done. So it was something that I know he'd considered, we had briefly considered together, and I know that it's something that he would have wished for.
You know, I think that's the most important part for the family, is knowing that they've done what their loved one wanted. It's that final act of service for them, carrying out their final wishes. And I think you're right, it gives you that peace of mind afterwards of knowing that you did the right thing for them and the right thing by them.
Organ donation is not certain either, especially in the situation that Tris was in. So although he had a brain injury, he wasn't brain dead. So you can only undertake organ donation if somebody, when taken off a ventilator, dies within a certain time frame. So the organs are as good as they can be. And so I knew that. I knew it was not a certainty. But nevertheless, I was very, it was very important to me that if at all possible that happened, and it did happen.
Yes, there are lots of conversations to have, aren't there? There's the conversations about your loved one's wishes. There's the conversations about how you make that decision and go through that at the time, how you're feeling, how your family are feeling. And there's the conversation about the practicalities too, which I know from the short time I've been in healthcare is easier once you work in that environment to think about the practicalities. But I guess for those who don't work in healthcare, who aren't a doctor like you are, Jill, that having those intensive care doctors and nurses to answer all those questions is a really important part of that process as well, making sure that people feel comfortable to ask any question. They're all valid questions, and they all help in making the decision and putting your mind at rest that you're doing the right thing.
Yes. That is absolutely true, because my world in primary care was very, very far away from a critical care environment, and so I did need to ask a lot of questions myself. Obviously I had knowledge, but layering on top of that the trauma of the situation, you don't necessarily think in a purely logical fashion. However, I think with regard to the organ donation side of things, I think that was very clear for me.
Did you spend a lot of time talking with Triss's family and your family before you made the decision?
No, actually, I don't think we did, not before I raised the issue of organ donation. My sister was in the room with me as we were by Triss's bedside when I asked Paul about whether organ donation was something that we could consider, and we did talk about it as a family. So the member of Triss's family who was present was Triss's brother, Jeremy, but he was supportive. The rest of our family were supportive. My brother-in-law, my sister's husband, was there. My other sister and her husband came, and no one had anything other than great support for organ donation.
That's really good to hear. That makes it easier, doesn't it?
It does.
As a family.
It does, because families who are not in the same place, it's extraordinarily difficult for them. And if there is disagreement, organ donation will not go ahead. So it's very important that there is agreement. And I say to people when I'm talking about organ donation is, I think the best way to try to deal with that is for individuals to make their wishes known to their families. Because although everyone will have their own views, and we live in a world where we're all entitled to have our own views and for those wishes to be expressed, if you know the wishes of the individual who then happens to be in a situation where organ donation is a possibility, if you know what they wanted, it is helpful.
Yeah, I can see that, Jill. I think you take the stress away from your family. If they know your wishes, they don't have a difficult decision to make, and that's what's come through as you've been talking, is that conversation, however difficult it is to talk about what it's going to be like when you're not here, if you can do that for your family so they're sure about what you want, it makes it so much easier for them to carry out those wishes.
I think it doesn't have to be a very difficult conversation. Well, I suppose it could be difficult if you're not on the same page, but it's just about knowing. Yeah. Because for most people, they're never ever going to be in a situation where that will arise and that decision has to be made. Organ donation is actually very rare.
I know, it's quite shocking, isn't it?
It is.
How low it is. And we were talking earlier about the circumstances. Everything has to be absolutely right, doesn't it? For the person, the circumstances, and for the conversation to have taken place, and for the family to be comfortable. And only if all those things are in place can organ donation take place. Which is part of the reason why I was so keen for you and I to talk so that more people can understand just how important it is to have had all those conversations, because it is really rare that you can get all of those things coming together. But if you can, then you give the gift of life to others, don't you? And not just one person.
No.
So when we first talked about Tris and you told me all the people that benefited, I was really struck that it wasn't just one person, it was so many. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
No, not at all. So he donated both kidneys. He couldn't donate other organs for whatever reason the specialist transplant surgeons determined, and that's obviously not a decision that you can get involved with as a family. I gave permission for any organ that could be utilised to be taken, but Tris also donated tissues, and tissues are things like eyes, corneas, heart valves, which he did donate, skin and bone, cartilage, and all of those tissues have been used. And the last time I was informed, which is a few years ago now, he'd helped up to 12 people with tissues. So I know that the corneas were used. I know that one was given to a man in his 30s and one to a man in his 80s. To restore sight is immense. And not only do you allow people to regain independent lives, the impact on their families and society in general, especially if they can return to work, is immeasurable. So tissues are considered to be life transforming rather than life saving. Organs are given to people who are desperately sick, and whilst kidneys are given to people who can be maintained for a while on dialysis. Dialysis is not an easy way to live. Having dialysis 3 times a week, you can't easily go on holiday, you can't really go anywhere, and you spend a lot of the time feeling unwell. So a transplant changes that. Other organs, we don't have the ability to maintain things in the way that dialysis does for very long periods of time. So organ donation really does save lives.
So that one experience with Tris led on to what's become a real passion for you in talking about organ donation, and one of the really powerful memories I've got in the hospital is the day we spent together setting up our Gift of Life artwork and the memorial wall for our donors and families. Would you like to say a bit more about that side of the work you do?
Yes, I really would. I became involved a few months after Tris died, when I went back to critical care, and I offered myself as a volunteer. And again, I no idea where that came from, because I hadn't thought about it in advance, but I did. I started to work with Paul and critical care colleagues. He then asked me to concentrate on organ donation. In it all, we have the most tremendous support from the Trust, and that extends from everyone. And I ask a lot of people for help, but I've never, as far as I can recall, ever had a negative response. It's hugely important to me that you and your senior team and those running the Trust understand about organ donation and the success of where we are as a Trust. You support us in whatever way you can, and the support that we had for the unveiling of our memorial artwork is really, really a wonderful example of that. So seven years ago, we had the Gift of Life artwork installed in the atrium, and the central plaque was unveiled by one of the deputy lieutenants from Kent, Peter Gilbert. I always wanted to personalise that artwork because I felt we should continue to honour our donors. Obviously it has to be subject to family consent, and so as you know, we have had an addition to the Gift of Life artwork with our hero wall panels, and if families have given consent, then we add donor names, and not only organ donors but tissue donors too, because they are responsible for giving enormous selfless gifts to those who benefit from those donations. We launched the memorial, the hero wall panels 2 years ago, as you know, in the middle of the end of the COVID pandemic, so we had to have a virtual ceremony, but we were honoured to have both you and Dale Gardner, the national clinical lead for organ donation, come to unveil the first of the panels. I believe we have a responsibility to honour donors. It's important for the families. It's also important for the hospital staff that were involved. It's important for the trust, and it's something on seeing those sorts of memorials that provokes conversation about organ and tissue donation for people walking past. In 2020 we had the law change.
Do you think that's helped?
Well, it sadly came in the middle of the COVID pandemic, so it was a very difficult time for everyone, but because law changes have to be planned a long way in advance, it couldn't be changed, the date couldn't be changed, so the deemed consent law came into force on the 20th of May 2020, and what it means is that unless you have opted out of being an organ donor, you are deemed to have given consent for organ donation should you be in the situation where it's appropriate. There are exclusions to that, so people under 18, people who don't have capacity, for instance. However, families are still asked if they are in the situation of being about to lose a loved one. And I think that is absolutely right. Some people say to me, well, why is the family asked? It's, the individual has already either expressed their wish to be a donor, because you can still be on the organ donor register, or they haven't opted out. However, families have to live with that decision. It's very, very important that they support it. The best way is for them to know what your wishes are in advance.
Absolutely, and I guess the other side of this equation is the need. There's an enormous need, isn't there, for organ and tissue donation?
There is.
And I know you do a lot of work with the national team. Are there a couple of things you'd like to highlight for people about the need?
I would. So during the COVID pandemic, as you might imagine, organ donation dropped. Never completely stopped, but it did drop because critical care units inevitably were full of very, very sick people with COVID. Obviously you couldn't risk giving COVID to a recipient from a donor. Donors were in short supply because of the numbers and the critical care time that was being devoted to people with COVID. Any recipient of a solid organ is required to have immunosuppressant treatment so they don't reject the organ, and that makes them much more vulnerable to infections like COVID. So it was a triple whammy really, and as I say, organ donation diminished significantly. We are now almost back to pre-pandemic levels, not quite, but almost. However, very sadly, those who are waiting for life-saving transplants, the numbers have climbed, and we are back at we have a list of about 7,000 on a transplant waiting list, and that equates to the numbers from about 2014. So the progress that we made pre-pandemic has been lost. Of those, they will not all get transplants. So people die waiting for organs, either because they get too sick or one doesn't come. Because although we do have some living donors for kidneys and sometimes liver, most of the organs come from people who have died. So inevitably that involves a tragedy for that family. But as we talked about in the beginning, it's something very positive that can come from an inevitable death. And if people are able to make those decisions to donate, then it really is life-saving for those recipients.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for everything you do for the hospital and for all of our patients that need organs, Jill. It has been an inspiration to work with you over the last 7 or 8 years. I don't know exactly how long it's been now, and I hope there are many more years ahead of us too.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all you do to support the work. It's invaluable.